Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about the rescue lied around the world. Let's get started. For many regular listeners, you might have noticed that we posted a day late this week, and that is because of the recent news coming out about the IDF's mission into Rafah in order to rescue 4 hostages still alive. For any of you who maybe haven't heard the news yet all over your social media, there was reports coming out about 2 days ago that the IDF did a top-secret mission into the Rafah region and were able to rescue 4 hostages still alive. Most famously is the hostage named Noah, the Israeli girl who is seen in a video taken by Hamas on a motorcycle, desperately pleading to be let go and fearing for her life as she's heading in with a bunch of terrorists to Gaza. Initial reports were speculative at first, and slowly the IDF officially confirmed and released video footage and a bunch of photos of the 4 hostages being released, and even some footage was put out with them being reunited with their family and friends, which brings tears to most of our eyes, knowing that these poor people were held in Hamas captivity for over 200 days. One, most famously, a young man, when he saw his mother in the hospital for the first time after being rescued, he literally collapsed on the floor out of complete and utter relief to finally see his mother. These heartbreaking images are not in a vacuum, because online at the same time, we see that the lies have already begun. And so, in keeping with our last episode about why people are lying, and if you haven't heard that one, please feel free to go back and listen. But why people are lying about the facts and the reality that we clearly see with our own eyes. But we'll get to that in a minute. Initially, in that vacuum I had mentioned where we don't really know what was going on, the IDF hadn't released official details too much at the time, and Hamas decided, as it always does, to fill it with misinformation. First, we got a lot of weird information coming out of the American media, likely from Hamas, that was saying that Hamas released hostages. And that key word, released, for anybody with a decent grasp of English would know that released would suggest some type of voluntary releasing of people, whereas we now know that that clearly isn't what happened. So it's possible that Hamas, knowing that they had lost 4 hostages and that Israel had taken them, that it would soon hit the media that 4 were freed. And so they tried to probably get ahead of it and make up false stories, feed them to the West to suggest that the hostages were released, as if Hamas is so great that they would just randomly, after 200 plus days, decided to release the hostages out of the kindness of their heart. We now know, obviously, that is a lie, and there's plenty of footage that the IDF has released from the body cameras of the soldiers, seeing them save these poor, innocent people. And it was absolutely a firefight. There was absolutely no releasing. It was a rescue mission. So that was the first lie we saw in order to change the narrative. Unfortunately, once the videos and information came out from the IDF and from various Israeli sources, that lie wasn't going to hold up. I mean, you don't have a firefight with people who are released willingly. And one thing I'll say in continuation from our last podcast last week is the fact that the pro-Pali/Hamas PR wing makes sure to release this fake information because it needs to fill the void and give its spokespeople and its online social media army, all the haters and the trolls online, they need to get the official message out really quickly. So that way when pro-Israel people post facts, they have a narrative that they can spin in order to try and disprove what's been said. So I wouldn't be surprised if the PR of Hamas literally has a team. Whenever something happens, they have to spin it. And within minutes, they've got their narrative. It's going out to the West. It's going out to social media people, the Eye on Palestine, and all these stupid accounts that are clearly run by Hamas-aligned people probably get the first information, and then it swarms out onto the internet like a virus. Once their initial narrative of hostages being released clearly didn't work, the next thing they had said, in order to try and muddy the waters and give some talking points, was that they claimed that Israel actually killed a number of hostages while trying to save them. So the idea that, I guess, Israel's bad because it killed its own hostages, which unfortunately in the past we do know that did happen by false identity. Unfortunately, these people were in a very bad place because they were being held captive and they were mistaken for terrorists and unfortunately killed by Israeli soldiers. We do know this has happened. So it's easy for the pro-Pali people to make up a lie that, oh, Israel actually killed all of their hostages. They didn't rescue anybody, in order to try and change the narrative. However, again, this doesn't work because we had people actually released and we saw video footage of them being released. We saw them meeting their families. But I think they even realized that that was a stretch and it really wasn't working because they almost immediately changed the narrative yet again. So they went in with a pinpoint strike with men on the ground. And the only people who were harmed that we know of were not innocent civilians, but people involved in keeping the hostages and trying to fight to ensure that those hostages were not released. Some reports have said that the Hamas people were even trying to shoot and kill the hostages before they had any chance to be released, which would go along with what we expect from Hamas. So the story quickly changed to hundreds of poor Gazan people were killed in this pinpoint strike by an elite strike force team, all on video, by the way. We've seen the videos. But apparently hundreds and hundreds of innocent babies and civilians in this area were killed by the Israelis and many, many, many more wounded. And this one seemed to hit a little bit because it seems plausible, right? You know, we hear the Israelis are bombing randomly, killing randomly. It seems to fit the narrative. So that one they kind of stuck with, even though it's completely untrue. And of course, by the way, let's point out the fact that they ignore that the Israelis were in fact rescuing hostages that were in fact in Rafah, but let's forget about that because innocent civilians we made up are dead. It's all about changing the narrative. Really, all they want is to change the news cycle. Rather than on news reports are we hearing Israelis rescue hostages being held in Rafah, which we told them not to go into Rafah, we want to change it to Israelis kill 200 people and injure many more. And then maybe put in a little bit of a footnote of, oh, by the way, they were rescuing some hostages. Mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, all these mainstream media were flooding the airwaves and the internet with all these fake stories right from the mouth of Hamas. And this allowed all of their Pali trolls online to stick with this narrative, and it seems to have stuck. But it's interesting because I've actually seen one more conspiracy theory, thanks to someone who trolls online who comments on literally all of our posts, which I actually have some fun with. But according to him, the newest idea is apparently that these hostages look too good to have been hostages. So a new form of this propaganda, or maybe even it's a fringe idea even amongst the pro-Palestinian people, is that apparently all of these people now were not actually hostages. This was all an elaborate scheme to pretend they were hostages and go fake rescue them when really they weren't actually rescued, minus the footage we've all seen. They weren't actually rescued. This was all a ploy just to kill 200 plus people and injure thousands more. This is the idea that they're now putting out online, which I think is actually laughable. I assume the parents of these people who've been crying for months to get their kids back were in on the scheme too. And I'm assuming all of these videos have been doctored, which is probably thousands and thousands of dollars worth of production to get these fake videos created, all to kill 200 people in Rafah. Which, by the way, doesn't make any sense when you think about these pro-Palis saying that Israel just indiscriminately carpet bombs everywhere. Up to this point, they've never had a quote-unquote excuse or a reason to kill hundreds and thousands of people, according to them. But now they apparently need to create a fake hostage situation in order to kill 200 people? Literally makes no sense, but you don't need to have any rationality when you're dealing with these people. All it is muddying the water in order to create a fake narrative and put questions into the Israeli truth. Let's muddy it with a bunch of garbage. What's even more disturbing is as these hostages were released, we started to hear more and more about their experience, which we're going to get to in a moment. But the most shocking situation, or maybe it shouldn't be that shocking, was the 3 young men who were held in Rafah. Apparently, according to them, and I believe this has been confirmed, were held by an Al Jazeera journalist in Gaza. So an Al Jazeera journalist, much like the people who participated on October 7th, was holding hostage with his doctor father 3 young men in captivity for 200 plus days. So it may make you think a little bit about Al Jazeera's quality of journalism, that their journalists not only took part in October 7th, but were holding hostages. And I also want to say, maybe question the doctors you always hear from in Gaza. People are dying. Israel's bombing randomly. Everyone's dead in our morgues and whatever. Maybe that doctor, who's this guy's father, also lies to the media, considering the fact that he apparently was holding hostages by himself. And these are supposed to be like regular Gazan people. Apparently they have some connection with Hamas, that they are entrusted to hold on to 3 male hostages and keep them tortured and locked up for 200 plus days. That doesn't happen by accident. Does this show some sort of media complicity in this whole situation? The fact that Al Jazeera journalists are not only taking part in the actions, but then spreading the misinformation to the rest of the world through Al Jazeera and through Western media sources. It's all about getting information out to make sure that lie is told more than the truth. And this really brings me to one of my biggest points of this podcast. The reality is, soon enough, the testimonies will start coming out from these hostages once they are free and have time to recuperate and deal with the trauma that they've just been through. But soon enough, in the next maybe week, you will start seeing clips of what they said happened to them. Like I've said on other podcasts, within 24 hours, you will start to see the pro-Pali lies and the media spin to poke holes in everything they say. They're going to claim that it's all a lie. These people are actors. None of this is true. Look how well they were treated. They never mentioned the word this or mentioned the word that, so therefore they must be lying, or they were treated perfectly when they were in captivity. Whatever the lies will be. They will also go one step further, which we did talk about in a previous podcast. They will also try and find a way to spin somehow this against the Israelis. It's a textbook play that they always do. Someone says they were raped. All of a sudden, people in Gaza are being raped. Someone says they were harmed in captivity and beaten and whatever. Somehow, all of a sudden, things come out about Israelis beating and harming people in prisons. It's literally word for word. Mark my words, it's going to happen, and you will see it soon. This is a clear example that we could see with our own eyes, the way that the pro-Pali PR machine works. And we talked about this in our last podcast, that lying doesn't help anything. As long as everybody is lying, nothing will change, nothing will get better. And we could see firsthand, immediately after the hostages are rescued, someone calls Hamas PR. PR puts out right away some false information through their social media channels, through Al Jazeera, through the world Western media, whatever it might be. And they start formulating the best plan. Okay, first let's say this. Ooh, that's not working. Okay, let's completely change it and do something completely different and hope no one notices or no one cares, because the reality is they buy everything we say. So let's change it. That didn't work. Let's try it again. Let's do it this way. And they just workshop ideas until the pro-Palestinian media picks it up, till the West picks it up, and it's always negative Israeli stories instead of the happy story of rescuing hostages and the fact that civilians in Rafah are still holding people. There are still people in captivity. And the fact that no one is saying, by the way, Hamas, why don't you let them go so this doesn't happen again? If we believe that anybody was hurt in this conflict, this recent issue, maybe you should let them go so that way we don't have this problem anymore. But no one's saying that. It's almost shocking that people aren't asking Israel to return the hostages. This was unfair. How dare you go rescue these people? We need you to do a ceasefire deal. That's the only way you get your people back and let 1,000 terrorists go. Unfortunately, there is some tragic news with this situation, and that is the fact of 2 deaths that happened. One was a leader among the Israeli soldiers who was killed while rescuing the hostages. And unfortunately, he sacrificed his life for these 4 people, a debt of gratitude that we could never repay. The people of Israel and Jews around the world knowing that these Israelis are putting their lives on the line to protect us, and we can never, ever repay them for that gift that they give the world. And secondly, we heard a happier story about the hostage Noah, whose mother unfortunately is dying of brain cancer, who said she wants to see her daughter released before she dies. She did get to see her daughter, but unfortunately, one of the hostages' father died the day before he was released. Some say in the family that he died of grief because he was longing for his son to come home, and sadly, he never got to see it. May both of their memories be a blessing to their families and their loved ones. We can never understand the pain and suffering that these families are feeling. And in the end, honestly, the amount of lies coming out after every single incident that happens in Gaza is off the charts. But this specific thing that we saw, this raid that turned into rescuing hostages and seeing in real time the way that the lies mutate and formulate in order to have pro-Pally online trolls say things like there were no hostages, or they were treated so well, look how well fed they are, or that Israel just used this as an excuse to kill 200 people. It's just a matter of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what will stick, and make sure that nobody's talking about the actual facts here, which is Hamas is clearly using civilian areas to hold their hostages. Those hostages are obviously known by the people around who are either complicit in holding hostages or they are too afraid to say anything, and that shows that Hamas needs to go. And this situation also proves how doctors and journalists and many other people are very, very much involved in this entire plot to demonize Israel and spread false information. And we can see, like we said last week, that these lies don't help anybody. If we are not willing to admit that there are clearly hostages in Rafah and that Israel clearly needs to go get them because obviously yet another ceasefire was turned down by Hamas, so what are we waiting for? Unfortunately, we did hear news that Hamas has put out an order to all of their terrorists currently holding people, and they have said that if the Israelis do try and rescue any more hostages, to try everything they can to kill the hostages first before being killed themselves in order to ensure that Israel doesn't get good news like we saw this week. Because in the end, this rescue has caused so many around the world to pass on the lies and misinformation of Hamas. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.